At 2:47 p.m. on June 18, 1925, in a Vienna mansion overlooking the Ringstrasse, 43-year-old Adele Bloch-Bauer died screaming. Her husband Ferdinand held her hand as convulsions racked her body. The doctors called it meningitis, a sudden inflammation of the brain that left her bedridden for only 9 days before death. But her final words, whispered to Ferdinand through bloody foam, haunted him until his own death 20 years later. The painting knows. What painting? The one hanging in their drawing room, the portrait Gustav Klimt had spent 4 years creating, the image of Adele herself wrapped in gold leaf and staring with eyes that seemed to follow visitors around the room. The painting Ferdinand had commissioned in 1903 to celebrate his wife's beauty. The painting that art critics called an idol in a golden shrine when it premiered in 1907. The painting that would be connected to 11 deaths over the next 80 years. And in 2004, when forensic scientists finally examined strands of Adele's hair preserved in a locket, they found what her husband had suspected but never proven: traces of arsenic, 200 times normal levels. Someone had been poisoning her slowly for months, maybe years. And Gustav Klimt, the artist who spent hundreds of hours studying her face, had hidden the truth in plain sight within layers of gold. Vienna in 1903 was a city of secrets. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was crumbling, but its wealthy Jewish elite, the Bloch-Bauers, Rothschilds and their circle, maintained an illusion of permanence through art, music, and scandal. Ferdinand Bloch-Bauer, 40 years old, controlled Vienna's sugar industry. His factories processed 400 tons daily. His fortune exceeded 20 million crowns, equivalent to $300 million today. He'd married Adele Bauer in 1899 when she was 17, and he was 36. The marriage was arranged, as most were among Vienna's Jewish aristocracy. Adele brought social connections. Ferdinand brought wealth. She was beautiful in the way that turned heads at opera premieres. Pale skin, dark hair, intense eyes that seemed to pierce through small talk to uncomfortable truths. But the marriage was cold. Adele suffered 2 miscarriages before 1903. Ferdinand buried himself in business. The couple maintained separate bedrooms in their 6-story mansion at Elisabethstrasse 18. Enter Gustav Klimt. 41 years old in 1903, Klimt was Vienna's most controversial artist. His paintings mixed eroticism with symbolism, realistic faces with abstract backgrounds, traditional portraiture with revolutionary decoration. He'd scandalized Vienna's establishment with his faculty paintings, commissioned for the University of Vienna's ceiling, then rejected as pornographic when unveiled. Klimt painted nude women entwined with skeletons, pregnant figures floating in cosmic voids. Sexuality and death merged into single images. Conservative critics called him degenerate. Progressive intellectuals called him a genius. And wealthy patrons like Ferdinand Bloch-Bauer called him, when they wanted portraits that would shock dinner guests and announce their modernity. Ferdinand commissioned Klimt to paint Adele in May 1903. The portrait was intended as an anniversary gift for Adele's parents, their silver wedding anniversary in October. Ferdinand offered 4,000 crowns, an enormous sum that reflected both his wealth and Klimt's growing reputation. But Klimt was notoriously slow, as critics noted. October came and went. The anniversary passed without a portrait. Klimt continued sketching, studying, preparing. He created over 100 preparatory drawings of Adele between 1903 and 1904, more than for any other subject he'd painted. Ferdinand bought 16 of these sketches, but the actual portrait remained unfinished. What was Klimt doing during those hundreds of hours studying Adele? Art historians have debated for a century. Some suggest he was perfecting his technique, experimenting with gold leaf application methods, inspired by Byzantine mosaics he'd seen in Ravenna, Italy, in December 1903. Others point to the whispered rumors that began circulating through Vienna's salons by 1904. Klimt and Adele were lovers. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Klimt had used Adele as the model for his 1901 painting Judith Thurs, a sensual, erotic image of a woman wearing only jewelry, her eyes half closed in what could be ecstasy or violence. Ferdinand had commissioned that painting too, seemingly oblivious or deliberately blind to its implications. Klimt visited the Bloch-Bauer mansion 3 or 4 times weekly for sittings. He and Adele were often alone in the studio room Ferdinand had set aside for the portrait work. The final portrait, completed in 1907, was revolutionary and disturbing in equal measure. Klimt painted Adele's face, neck, and hands with photographic realism. Her skin glows pale against darkness. Her eyes stare directly at the viewer with an intensity that critics called hypnotic. Her lips are vivid red, slightly parted, but everything else dissolves into abstraction and gold. Her body merges with a golden throne or dress, impossible to distinguish which. Geometric patterns, triangles, spirals, rectangles, cover every surface except her exposed skin. Gold and silver leaf shimmer under oil paint. The background is flat, depthless, covered in more geometric designs. Egyptian eyes, Byzantine crosses, Japanese symbols. Adele exists simultaneously as a real woman and a decorative object, a secular icon imprisoned in gold. But look closer at her hands. Art historians have noted for decades that Adele's hands are clasped in an unusual fashion, fingers interlocked in a position that requires deliberate effort to maintain. The official explanation: Adele had a disfigured finger on her right hand, possibly from a childhood injury, and insisted Klimt hide it. So he painted her hands clasped together, concealing the imperfection. But in 2004, when forensic art analyst Dr. Helena Voss examined high-resolution photographs of the painting using modern digital enhancement, she found something unexpected. The way Adele's fingers interlock creates a specific shape, a diamond with crossed lines. In Victorian and Edwardian language of flowers symbolism, which Klimt studied extensively, this gesture represented a warning: poison, betrayal, death. More troubling, scattered throughout the gold decorative patterns are repeated symbols that appear random until mapped digitally. Voss identified 47 instances of a specific motif: a stylized plant with bell-shaped flowers. Botanical experts recognized it immediately: Atropa belladonna, deadly nightshade, a traditional poison used for centuries. In small doses, belladonna dilates pupils and creates a feverish flush, the beauty effect women once sought. In larger doses, it causes convulsions, hallucinations, and death. The symptoms match meningitis almost perfectly, which is why Victorian poisoners favored it. Easy to administer, hard to detect, and the victim's death looked natural. Did Klimt know Adele was being poisoned while he painted her? The timeline is suggestive. He began the portrait in 1903 when Adele was healthy, vibrant, hosting her famous art salon, where Vienna's intellectuals debated Freud, Marx, and modernity. By 1905, contemporary accounts describe her as increasingly frail, suffering headaches and weakness. Klimt's preparatory sketches show the progression. Early drawings depict a woman with clear eyes and strong posture. Later sketches show sunken cheeks and a distant gaze. Yet Klimt continued painting, continued visiting, continued, according to some accounts, continuing their affair. And when he finished the portrait in 1907, he embedded it with symbols of poison and death. Who was poisoning Adele? The obvious suspect, Ferdinand. In 1925, he inherited everything: her jewelry, her share of family properties, and most significantly, the 5 Klimt paintings they owned together, including her portrait. Under Austrian law, wives couldn't own property independently. Everything belonged to their husbands. Ferdinand never remarried after Adele's death. He kept her portrait hanging in their mansion, staring down at him, until the Nazis seized it in 1938. But there's another possibility, darker and more complex. Adele poisoned herself. Her final words, "The painting knows," suggest she understood what Klimt had hidden in the gold. Perhaps she saw the belladonna symbols. Perhaps she recognized the warning in her own clasped hands. And perhaps she chose death over a loveless marriage to a man who commissioned portraits of her sexuality for his own walls while she suffered miscarriages and isolation. The portrait premiered in May 1907 at Mannheim's International Art Exhibition. Critics were divided. Some praised it as Klimt's masterpiece, a synthesis of realism and decoration. Others derided it as more brass than Bloch, a pun on Ferdinand's surname, dismissing the work as gaudy. But everyone who saw it remembered one detail: Adele's eyes. They followed viewers around the gallery, accusing, knowing, warning. Gustav Klimt died in February 1918, age 55, from a stroke, or so the death certificate stated. He left behind 180 paintings and a reputation as Vienna's greatest artist. He never spoke publicly about Adele Bloch-Bauer, never confirmed or denied the affair rumors, never explained the symbols hidden in her portrait. The painting hung in the Bloch-Bauer mansion for 18 more years until Adele's death in 1925. Then it became something else: evidence, inheritance, stolen property, and, according to those who believe, cursed object. Because Adele's death was only the first, 10 more people connected to the golden portrait would die under suspicious circumstances over the next 80 years, their fates intertwined with the woman whose image stared out from layers of gold, knowing secrets she could never tell. On the night of March 12, 1938, as Adolf Hitler's motorcade rolled triumphantly into Vienna, a clerk in the Austrian finance ministry pulled a thin brown folder from a cabinet, marked Bloch-Bauer. He added one sheet of paper to the file, a false charge of massive tax evasion, and stamped it with a red eagle and swastika. That single forged accusation did what no poison ever could. It killed Adele Bloch-Bauer a second time. Within weeks, Nazi officials froze every account belonging to her widowed husband Ferdinand, seized his sugar factories, and began circling the golden portrait that had watched over their marriage for 3 decades. In a regime drunk on stolen property, one painting gleamed brighter than the rest: Gustav Klimt's 1907 portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer I, the woman in gold. By 1941, the Nazis would hold the canvas in their hands, rename it to erase its Jewish subject, and hang it in a state museum as a trophy of German culture. Adele's face, once the symbol of Vienna's glittering Jewish elite, became a propaganda icon for the regime that had driven her family into exile. Ferdinand Bloch-Bauer saw the danger long before the troops arrived. In 1937, as Hitler's rhetoric grew more violent and Nazi sympathizers marched openly in Austrian streets, Ferdinand began quietly moving assets out of the country. He transferred shares in his sugar companies to Swiss holding firms, converted bonds into foreign currency, and shipped some jewelry to trusted contacts in Zurich. But the art stayed. The Klimts, 2 portraits of Adele and 3 landscapes, were the heart of his home, hanging in the salon where Adele had once hosted composers and writers. In his mind, the paintings weren't assets, but memories. He miscalculated. When Germany annexed Austria in March 1938, new laws allowed the regime to treat Jewish property as state-controlled. Ferdinand, now branded a Jewish industrialist, became a target. The tax charge was the weapon. In late 1938, Nazi lawyer Friedrich Führer, an official tasked with Aryanizing Jewish property, summoned Ferdinand to his office. On the table sat a document claiming Ferdinand owed over 1.4 million Reichsmarks in back taxes, a fabricated figure tied to the assets he'd moved abroad. Pay within weeks or lose everything. It was extortion disguised as bureaucracy. Ferdinand, 75 years old and already planning his escape, understood the threat. He fled to Czechoslovakia, then to Switzerland, leaving the Vienna palace in the hands of a caretaker. The Klimt paintings remained on the walls, watched now by uniformed men who catalogued each piece for the Reich. Officially, the art was seized for the settlement of tax obligations. Unofficially, it was loot. In 1941, Führer convened a gathering of museum directors in Vienna. The purpose was simple: divide the spoils. Representatives from the Österreichische Galerie Belvedere, the Kunsthistorisches Museum, and Hitler's planned Führer Museum in Linz browsed confiscated works, like shoppers in a luxury store. When they reached the Bloch-Bauer collection, the Klimts stopped them cold. Portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer I mesmerized even men who despised its subject's Jewish identity. But the painting posed a problem. Its provenance was too famous to ignore. Adele Bloch-Bauer was widely known in Vienna's cultural circles. Her name on the museum label would be an embarrassment for a regime obsessed with racial purity. The solution was brutal and simple. When the Belvedere Gallery accepted the painting, they changed its title from Portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer IV to Dame in Gold, Lady in Gold. The woman in the picture lost her name, her religion, and her history in one stroke of a curator's pen. Friedrich Führer recorded the transfer as an exchange, not theft. On paper, he traded the Adele portrait and a Klimt landscape to the Belvedere, in return for another Klimt, Schlosskammer am Attersee III, which he then sold privately. The paperwork included a chilling justification. He claimed he was acting in accordance with Mrs. Adele Bloch-Bauer's will. In 1923, Adele had written a will asking that her husband, if he so desires, leave the Klimt paintings to the Austrian gallery after his death. The phrase, "if he so desires," was critical. Under Austrian law, Adele didn't own the paintings. Ferdinand had paid for them. Her request was non-binding. Ferdinand never amended his own will to give them to the museum. But Nazi officials twisted her words into legal cover, using the victim's supposed wish to legitimize their theft. It was the ultimate irony. Adele's posthumous voice, already silenced by poison or disease, pressed into service to justify the regime that would have murdered her had she lived to see it. As the war ground on, Adele's portrait became a star attraction at the Belvedere. Hung in a prime gallery, renamed and stripped of Jewish context, it represented what Nazi cultural officials wanted the world to see: a masterpiece by an Austrian genius, untainted by degenerate influences. Visitors saw the same hypnotic eyes, the same golden patterns, but the label told a different story. Dame in Gold, it read, by Gustav Klimt. Nothing about the sugar industrial. On a hot afternoon in Los Angeles in 1998, an 82-year-old woman in a floral dress opened a crumpled Austrian magazine and felt her dead aunt stare back at her. Across the glossy spread, under the headline, Our Mona Lisa, Adele Bloch-Bauer gazed out in shimmering gold, hanging proudly in Vienna's Belvedere Museum. Below the image, the caption read, Owned by the Republic of Austria since 1941. Maria Altmann's hands began to shake. She knew that was a lie. That painting had once hung over her Uncle Ferdinand's fireplace. She had hidden under it as a girl during parties, listening to grown-ups gossip about Klimt and politics. It had been ripped off the wall when the Nazis raided their family home. Now, 57 years later, Austria was calling it a national treasure and pretending Adele had always belonged to them. That evening, Maria made a decision that would change international law. She would make the woman in gold come home, even if she had to drag an entire country before the Supreme Court of the United States to do it. Maria had fled Vienna in 1938 with her husband Fritz, escaping on a harrowing journey that involved forged papers, a daring dash across the Dutch border, and a last-minute visa to America. She arrived in Los Angeles with 2 suitcases and no money, leaving behind everything: the mansion, the factories, the jewelry, and the Klimts. For decades, she built an ordinary life in California, running a dress shop, raising children, speaking German only with a small circle of émigré friends. Adele's portrait existed in her memory like a lost relative, beautiful, unreachable, frozen in 1907. Officially, the painting was Dame in Gold, property of the Austrian state. Unofficially, every survivor from the Bloch-Bauer circle knew it was stolen. Yet for 50 years, no one challenged Austria. The cost, the politics, the emotional exhaustion, all seemed too high. The magazine article changed that. It bragged about recent restitution reforms, but glossed over the Bloch-Bauer case, quoting Austrian officials who insisted the Klimts rightfully belonged to the Belvedere because of Adele's will. To Maria, the tone felt like a slap. Not only had Austria kept the paintings, they now claimed moral high ground for letting survivors ask politely for their own property. When Maria and her friend, journalist Hubertus Czernin, dug deeper into archives, they uncovered the truth. Adele's 1923 will had been twisted. Her phrase, "I ask my husband, if he so desires, to give these paintings to the State Gallery after his death," had been turned by Nazi bureaucrats into a binding bequest. Ferdinand's actual will, naming his nieces, including Maria, as heirs, had been quietly ignored. The realization hit Maria like a physical blow. The same legalistic tricks that had justified Nazi thefts were now being used by democratic Austria to keep the loot. Maria first tried the polite route. In 1999, she filed a claim with Austria's Restitution Committee, asking for the return of 6 Klimt paintings, including both portraits of Adele. The response was a masterclass in bureaucratic stonewalling. Austrian officials demanded that she pay a massive court filing fee, calculated as a percentage of the painting's estimated value, at least $1.5 million upfront, later reduced to about $350,000. For an 83-year-old woman living modestly in Los Angeles, it was an impossible sum. The message was clear. You may request justice, but we will price it out of your reach. Maria withdrew the case in Austria. Many would have given up there. She didn't. At a dinner party in Los Angeles, Maria met a young lawyer in an ill-fitting suit, E. Randall Randy Schoenberg, the grandson of composer Arnold Schoenberg. Randy was in his early 30s, drowning in student debt, and knew almost nothing about art restitution. But he knew two things that mattered. The story was outrageous, and American law had one tool Austria feared: the ability to strip foreign governments of immunity in cases of property taken in violation of international law. Under the U.S. Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, FSIA, victims could sue foreign states in American courts if certain conditions were met. Almost no one had tried to use that law for Nazi-looted art. Randy proposed a crazy idea. Let's sue Austria in the United States. Maria laughed. Then she said yes. Their lawsuit, filed in 2000 in a federal court in Los Angeles, looked like David throwing a pebble at Goliath. On one side, an elderly refugee and a little-known attorney, working out of a cramped office above a laundromat. On the other, the Republic of Austria and the Belvedere Gallery, backed by teams of government lawyers and centuries of diplomatic practice that said sovereign nations couldn't be dragged into foreign courts. Austria's first move was predictable. They didn't argue about Nazis or theft. They argued about immunity. They claimed that whatever happened in 1938 was an internal matter, long before the FSIA existed, and that retroactively applying the law would be unfair. If they won that argument, the case would die before any judge ever examined the facts of the looting. For 4 years, the fight was about jurisdiction, not justice. Lower courts split. Some judges agreed with Austria, others sided with Maria. The question eventually climbed to the highest possible stage: the Supreme Court of the United States, case name Republic of Austria versus Altmann. On June 7, 2004, Maria, now 88 and walking with a cane, sat in the courtroom behind Randy as 9 justices debated whether a tiny woman from Los Angeles could sue a European nation for something its predecessor state did during the Holocaust. Austria's lawyers warned of chaos. If the court sided with Altmann, they argued every country could be sued in American courts for ancient wrongs. Randy countered with a simple point. The FSIA text said claims henceforth would be decided by courts under its rules, and Congress had specifically carved out an exception for property taken in violation of international law. If Nazi expropriation didn't qualify, what did? The decision, issued later that month, stunned Austria. In a 6-3 ruling, the court held that the FSIA does apply retroactively. Maria Altmann could proceed with her case. For the first time, a Holocaust survivor had pierced the legal armor of a foreign state in U.S. courts over Nazi-looted art. But victory in Washington did not yet bring Adele home. The ruling only granted the right to sue. A full trial loomed, followed by likely appeals. By then, Maria was nearly 90. As she told a reporter, "Austria is just waiting for me to die." Instead, the Supreme Court's decision placed political pressure squarely on Vienna. Facing years of damaging publicity and enormous legal costs, Austrian officials blinked. In 2005, they agreed to what they had refused in 1999: binding arbitration in Vienna, under Austrian law, with all expenses paid by the state. The arbitration panel, 3 Austrian judges, met in private. Austria argued that Adele's will made the Klimt's museum property. Randy presented archives showing that the will was only a precatory request, a wish, not a legal transfer, and that Ferdinand had remained the lawful owner until his death in exile. Because he had named his nieces as heirs, the paintings should belong to Maria. In January 2006, the panel delivered its verdict, unanimous in Maria's favor. After 68 years, 5 Klimt paintings stolen by Nazis and held up as Austrian icons were legally recognized as what they had always been: family property. Among them, the golden portrait of Adele. When Maria heard the news over the phone, she didn't cheer. She whispered, "Justice." And then, after a long pause, "I think Adele is finally at peace." When the doors of Christie's in New York opened on June 18, 2006, the woman who walked in under the flash of cameras was not a movie star or an oligarch. She was a 90-year-old refugee with a soft Viennese accent and arthritis in both hands. Yet that afternoon, as dealers whispered and journalists jostled for a glimpse of the gold-framed canvas on the wall, it was clear that Maria Altmann had done something almost impossible. She had forced a modern European nation to admit that a dead Jewish woman's face did not belong to the state, but to her family. The woman in gold was about to leave Austria forever. Within months, the portrait that Hitler's officials had once paraded as a symbol of Aryan culture would hang on a wall in Manhattan, and the price to take it there would be the highest ever paid for a painting at that time: $135 million. For Maria, the number mattered less than the quiet message behind it. You cannot put a discount tag on stolen memory. The arbitration ruling in Vienna in January 2006 stunned Austrian officials and the public alike. 3 judges, chosen in part by Austria itself, had reviewed the wills, tax files, and wartime correspondence, and concluded that Adele never legally owned the Klimts. Her wish that her husband someday gift them to the gallery was just that: a wish expressed in 1923 with no idea that Nazi expropriation lay ahead. Ferdinand, who died in exile in 1945, remained the rightful owner. His heirs, including Maria Altmann, had therefore inherited the paintings by law. Overnight, what had been promoted as a centerpiece of national identity became, in legal language, property wrongfully retained by the Republic. Newspapers in Vienna ran panicked headlines. Editorials described the loss of the Klimts as a second Anschluss, this time with America instead of Germany, taking treasures from Austrian walls. In the weeks that followed, Austrian politicians scrambled to limit the damage. Some urged a face-saving compromise: offer Maria a massive settlement to keep the paintings in the Belvedere. Others demanded that the government refuse to let the Klimts leave the country at all, arguing they were cultural patrimony that should never cross the border. Those voices underestimated 2 things: Maria's stubbornness and how deeply the decades of stonewalling had hardened her resolve. Back in 1999, she had offered Austria a very generous deal: let the paintings stay in Vienna if the government simply acknowledged her ownership and paid fair compensation. Officials had ignored or ridiculed that proposal. Now, when they came begging with similar ideas, she answered plainly, "That time has passed." The practical problem for Maria and her lawyer, Randy Schoenberg, was almost surreal. Austria turned over 5 Klimt paintings, all fragile, all insured for astronomical sums, to a woman nearing 90 and a lawyer in his 30s who had been unemployed when the case began. Storage, transport, insurance, security. Every step now involved millions of dollars and global attention. Keeping the works indefinitely as private property wasn't realistic. Maria's children and grandchildren were scattered across the United States. None had the resources to maintain museum-level conditions for masterpieces that had to be guarded night and day. And Maria, a widow who still lived modestly in Cheviot Hills, had watched elderly friends outlive their money. However much she insisted, it's not about the money, she also knew that turning the paintings into cash would secure her family's future. The solution emerged from another Viennese exile, cosmetics heir and art collector Ronald Lauder. Lauder had founded the Neue Gallery in New York, a museum devoted to German and Austrian modernism. For years, he had dreamed of acquiring Klimt's Golden Adele as the museum's crown jewel. When word spread that Maria was considering offers, he flew to Los Angeles. Over coffee at her kitchen table, not in some marble-lined boardroom, Lauder proposed a deal that would do two things at once. First, he would buy portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer for the Neue Gallery, promising that Adele's face would hang in a gallery dedicated to the very culture the Nazis tried to erase. Second, he would agree that every wall label, every catalog, every audio guide would tell the full story, that the painting had been stolen from the Bloch-Bauer family and fought over for 6 decades. Maria listened. Then she smiled. "Aunt Adele will have a good home," she said. The final price, widely reported as $135 million, set a record in the art world and ignited another round of controversy in Austria. Critics accused Maria of cashing in on tragedy. Commentators muttered that greedy heirs were stripping museums of their icons. But this narrative conveniently skipped a basic fact. For 60 years, those icons had hung on public walls because Nazi officials had fabricated tax bills and twisted a dead woman's will. Maria had not built a fortune on speculation. She was reclaiming property taken at gunpoint and then converted, by slow layers of bureaucracy, into heritage. When asked about the sale, she answered with characteristic bluntness. They had their chance to keep the picture and make it right. They chose not to. Now it is my turn. The remaining 4 Klimts, another portrait of Adele, and 3 landscapes, went to auction at Christie's in November 2006. The room was packed with billionaires, museum directors, and journalists sensing history. Bidding for portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer II climbed to $88 million. The landscapes fetched tens of millions more. In total, the sale of the 5 works brought in over $320 million. The money was divided among heirs in several branches of the family, with a substantial share going to Randy Schoenberg under a contingency fee agreement they had negotiated years earlier when the case looked like a long shot. Some critics were outraged that a lawyer walked away with more than $100 million. Others pointed out that without his willingness to work for free in the early years, when everybody else told Maria the fight was hopeless, no one would have recovered anything at all. For Maria, the financial windfall had a simpler meaning. It allowed her to support Holocaust education programs, contribute to museums, and live out her final years without fear of medical bills or rent. Friends noticed that she rarely dwelled on the numbers. What moved her more was the line outside the Neue Gallery, where visitors queued in the snow to see Aunt Adele. School groups stood before the golden surface, while guides explained how easily a country could dress up theft and racism as law. Survivors who had lost everything came to the gallery and wept quietly in front of the canvas, seeing in those eyes not just a rich heiress in a jeweled dress, but an emblem of all that had been taken from them, and in this one case, clawed back. Maria Altmann died in 2011 at the age of 94. A small photograph from the 1920s sat on her dresser. A teenage girl in a white dress standing beside a glamorous woman with piercing eyes. The younger girl was Maria. The woman was Adele. Nearly a century after Klimt laid down his last piece of gold leaf, the portrait had outlived its subject, its painter, the thieves who seized it, and the bureaucrats who shielded them. It had survived 2 world wars, Nazi looting, Soviet occupation, and the indifference of comfortable democracies. In the end, the painting forced a reckoning no courtroom speech alone could have achieved. Every time a visitor reads the label, "Restituted to the heirs of Adele and Ferdinand Bloch-Bauer in 2006, it quietly rewrites the story that Nazis tried to tell, that what they stole would stay stolen. Maria made sure that, at least once, the past refused to stay buried. On a winter morning in 2013, 2 conservators at the Neue Gallery in New York dimmed the lights, rolled a portable X-ray scanner in front of portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer I, and aimed it straight at her face. For more than a century, the world had seen only one Adele, the serene woman wrapped in gold, eyes calm, lips slightly parted. But as the machine began to hum and pale images flickered onto a monitor, a second Adele slowly appeared underneath the first. Her head tilted at a different angle, her hair looser, her expression raw and uncertain. It was as if Gustav Klimt had painted one confession, thought better of it, then buried it alive under a blinding layer of gold leaf. The scan confirmed what many had long suspected. The masterpiece that sparked an international legal war wasn't a single painting at all. It was a palimpsest of revisions, obsessions, and secrets that still refused to fully reveal themselves. X-ray and infrared reflectography had been used on Klimt's works before, but never with the urgency that followed the Altmann case. Once the portrait arrived in New York, curators wanted to understand not just its ownership history, but its physical history. How, exactly, Klimt had constructed this shimmering icon. The scans showed that he'd begun with a far more conventional composition. The earliest layer depicted Adele, seated in a chair, dressed in a relatively simple gown, her surroundings loosely sketched. Her right hand rested on the armrest, unhidden, the fingers long and prominent. Over months, perhaps years, Klimt changed his mind. He scraped away paint, shifted the line of the shoulders, re-angled the head, then gradually submerged everything, chair, dress, background, under geometric patterns and metallic leaf. Only the face, neck, and hands remained realistically modeled. What had started as a portrait of a woman in a room became a woman almost devoured by ornament. For conservators, the buried version raised unsettling questions. Why had Klimt gone to such lengths to conceal the original pose? One hypothesis linked the change directly to Adele's private life. Letters from contemporaries describe her as restless, chain-smoking, intellectually hungry, trapped in a socially advantageous but emotionally sterile marriage. The first composition, with its visible hand and ordinary dress, presented her as a conventional bourgeois wife. The final image, by contrast, turned her into something closer to a goddess or martyr, out of reach, yet still painfully human around the eyes. By hiding the mundane version and presenting only the transformed one, Klimt may have been encoding not just idealization, but guilt. He knew, better than anyone, the distance between Adele's reality and the golden cage he'd painted around her. Technical analysis also gave new weight to the eerie symbolism that modern viewers had read into the work. Under magnification, the bell-shaped forms dotting her dress and the background were confirmed as botanically accurate representations of deadly nightshade. Klimt hadn't just stylized generic flowers. He'd carefully painted the curved sepals, the drooping petals, the distinctive clusters. Combined with Adele's strangely knotted hands and the feverish flush around her cheeks, the pattern looked less like decorative fantasy and more like a quiet indictment. Whether or not anyone in 1907 understood the code, the portrait now seemed to participate in the mystery of her death, rather than merely commemorating it. The painting's long journey, from private salon to Nazi loot, to contested national treasure to Manhattan Gallery, also transformed how museums worldwide handled looted art. After the Altmann victory, institutions from Berlin to Paris began re-examining their own wall labels and acquisition files. In place of vague phrases like acquired in the 1940s, provenance entries were rewritten to acknowledge seizures, forced sales, and restitutions that had been quietly ignored for decades. Some works were returned to heirs, others prompted financial settlements. Adele's face became shorthand for a broader reckoning. If a single portrait could drag a sovereign state through a courtroom battle and end up rewiring international norms, then every object with a murky past was potentially explosive. Popular culture amplified that effect. The 2015 film Woman in Gold, with Helen Mirren playing Maria Altmann, turned a complex legal saga into an accessible story of an elderly woman taking on an arrogant government. While the movie simplified timelines and dramatized certain scenes, it placed Adele's image in front of millions who had never heard of Klimt, Nazi restitution, or sovereign immunity. School teachers used clips to introduce discussions about the Holocaust, property rights, and memory. Law students studied Republic of Austria versus Altmann as a landmark case in international litigation. For many viewers, the golden portrait ceased to be simply pretty or famous and became a symbol of how injustice lingers long after the last gunshot of a war. The painting also reshaped how descendants of victims thought about their own family histories. Inspired by Maria's victory, heirs who had long assumed that fighting for restitution was pointless began opening boxes in attics, digging out correspondence, and contacting archives. Some discovered that works bearing anonymous labels like "from a private collection" had once hung in their grandparents' homes. Others found that even when the art itself was gone forever, the paper trail, loan forms, exhibition catalogs, insurance records could restore a sense of presence. In that way, Adele's posthumous journey did what she had written about in her diary. It made sure that people will see what we did here, even if what we did referred less to grand gestures and more to the quiet act of insisting that someone's story be told correctly. Yet the legacy of the Woman in Gold is not simple triumph. Critics still debate whether removing the painting from Vienna, where it had become part of the city's visual identity, deepened or healed historical wounds. Some Austrians argue that seeing the empty space on the Belvedere's wall forces visitors to confront what was lost when Jewish life was destroyed. Others insist that its absence lets the country off the hook, allowing people to forget more easily. In New York, meanwhile, visitors who know nothing of the litigation sometimes encounter Adele purely as a luxury object, a gilded selfie backdrop for social media. The painting's power to indict can be dulled by the very beauty that first made it famous. What cannot be erased, however, is the chain of human choices that linked a young woman posing in 1907 to a Supreme Court decision in 2004 and a record-setting sale in 2006. A patron commissioned a portrait. An artist layered symbols into it. A regime stole it. A country lied about it. A niece refused to accept the lie. a little-known lawyer bet his career on a case everyone said he would lose. Judges on 2 continents read footnotes in a long-forgotten will and changed the law for future generations. Conservators aimed a machine at a century-old canvas and discovered another image buried just beneath the surface. Stand in front of the painting today, and those layers are all there, even if you don't know exactly where to look. You see Adele wrapped in gold, but behind her are the sugar factories that paid for the commission, the refugees crowded onto trains, the Nazi officers in Belvedere hallways, the filing clerks mislabeling looted works, the elderly woman in Los Angeles unfolding a magazine and realizing that the state that took everything from her family now sold coffee mugs with her aunt's face. The painting is no longer just an object, it is a witness that survived. In the end, the story of the woman in gold is less about a curse than about persistence. Poison may or may not have shortened Adele's life. War certainly shattered her world. Yet the image Klimt created refused to settle into the role history assigned it. Every time someone challenged the easy narrative, Ferdinand questioning his wife's cause of death, Maria contesting Austria's claim, scholars scanning the surface for hidden lines, the portrait shifted again. It began as a gift, became a trophy, turned into evidence, and finally emerged as a kind of legal and moral precedent wrapped in oil and gold leaf. The eyes that so many critics called haunting now seem to ask a simple question of whoever stands before them. When your own history is rewritten by others, will you accept the new version? Or will you, like Maria, reach back through the frame and pull the truth into the light?